Hello, everyone, and welcome to Growing Together, a gardening podcast with me, John Lamb, and Don Kinsler, a lifelong gardener and the North Dakota State University Extension horticulturist for Cass County. Don, how are you doing?
I'm doing great, John, and I am reveling in this nice long fall we've had.
Yeah, here we are. We're in kind of mid to late October, and we've gotten more moisture, we've gotten more precipitation. It seems in October than we did for maybe not most of the summer. We had a couple good downpours then, but
our lawn looks better than it did all summer.
Yeah, we've got
I'm
more
loving
consistent rain, I think.
The lawns have recovered nicely for most of the region.
Yeah, and that's going to really do well going into winter, isn't it?
Oh, yeah, definitely. And for next year, because the recovery that lawns made this fall here, the roots are going to form nicely, and so next year's lawn should be better because this fall has been nice.
That's really good. That's good to hear. Hey, so I got a joke for you. Why was the jack-o'-lantern so forgetful?
I'm not sure. Why was the jack-o'-lantern so forgetful?
Because he's empty-headed.
Of course.
Why was the jack-o'-lantern so afraid?
I don't know.
Because he had no guts.
Those are good.
So we're using all these jack-o'-lantern jokes because we're going to talk about pumpkins today. We thought that this would be kind of a fun topic, a fun time to talk about it because not only with Halloween around the corner, but just pumpkins are kind of everywhere. And
they absolutely are.
And, you know, I would say even over the last 20 years, the utility of pumpkins has grown a lot more. And
hasn't it, though?
The appreciation of it. I mean, I'm not just talking about pumpkin spice latte, but I mean, like pumpkins as decor, as decorations inside and outside. Pumpkins certainly are on Halloween, but also pumpkins to eat. Using pumpkins in as food sources and in different aspects of food.
Yeah, definitely. You know, we of course had pumpkins when I was a kid, but you know, we didn't see them on every doorstep. As fall decorations.
Yeah.
And now, you know, they really just not just carved as a jack-o'-lantern, but in fall-type decorations, you know, the straw bales, the pumpkins, and a few mum pots, and it just makes a really nice fall decoration.
Yeah.
And I don't remember pumpkin soup being a thing when I was a kid.
No.
But that's really good. So it's kind of fun. Pumpkins are in a heyday.
And, you know, the pumpkin pies around Thanksgiving, but now you're seeing even things like pumpkin brulees. I think pumpkin bread, my mom made that, 40 years ago.
So. Right.
But, I think just kind of the explosion of it as explosion pumpkins is kind of funny. But, the proliferation of it we're seeing
we're in
so
pumpkin
much.
good times. We are. A good time to be a pumpkin.
So we're going to talk a little bit about how to grow pumpkins and the kind of the pumpkins in pop culture kind of. But let's start with where do kind of pumpkins come from? Because they are very American food. Maybe not necessarily North American, but they are an American food.
Well, they are. And, you know, what's fun about talking about pumpkins now is I did not know this, but apparently October 26th is National Pumpkin Day.
Well, here we are. What great timing.
Oh, yeah, what good timing. Yeah. So anyway, the pumpkin, is native to North America, to northern Mexico, and the southern United States also. So it's kind of fun to have a vegetable like that is actually native. So no wonder it grows so well, because anything that native usually does, because it's so well adapted. So it's kind of fun. And, I think of some of the things that were introduced into this country, such as the dandelions that are all over the place, but oftentimes the native type things play nicely in our area. For example, pumpkin has not become a weed. You know, I guess that would be a dangerous weed if we had large pumpkins growing all over our yards or something. But, you know, it's kind of neat. And so the word pumpkin itself is kind of interesting. Sometimes the derivative of some of these words is kind of fascinating. And apparently the word pumpkin could have been derived from a Greek word that meant large melon. But also there was a Native America word that was very close to pumpkin, and so it could have derived from that too. So anyway, the other thing that's kind of neat is When the English settlers came to Plymouth Colony in Massachusetts, the Native Americans introduced them fairly quickly to pumpkins. So they've been around since the settlers came, and of course the Native Americans, this is one of their staple foods. So it's kind of awesome. It's like pumpkins have been here as long as the continent has. Oh, the other thing too that's fascinating is the pumpkin is one of the oldest cultivated foods on record. I believe, when you look up Wikipedia, it's probably been around since around 7,000 BC, possibly. And so it's been used a long, long time.
Well, what's interesting about that too is that that not only, so you have the Native Americans introducing the Pilgrims, the settlers, to the pumpkin, and they turned around, they brought it back to Europe, and so the pumpkins really spread, after that encounter with the Indians, with the American Indians, the Native Americans, that it's really gone back to Europe, and then it's spread even from Europe. It's kind of spread now into parts of Africa too.
Yeah, exactly. So that's been fun, and they've even found seeds of pumpkins in Mexico going back to around 7,000 BC or so. So even, I don't know if those pumpkin seeds were still viable or not, but they found seeds that were even that old, I suppose, preserved somewhere. But yeah, it's interesting, kind of similar to tomato, indigenous to North America, South America, and that was taken back by the Europeans. And so it's kind of fun the way that some of these have come.
Yeah, something that the Americas gave to the rest of the world.
Yeah, so it's kind of fun. It's interesting, and we'll talk about the food uses too later. But you mentioned how the pumpkin taken to Africa. In the country of Zambia, they not only eat the fruit of the pumpkin, but they eat the leaves too in a boiled dish. So yeah, it's kind of fun how it's been taken to different continents with different uses.
So I think one question that I always had, and that probably a lot of other people have, is there a difference between pumpkin and squash?
Yeah, that is fun. And of course, if you do a little internet search on what's the difference between a pumpkin and a squash, you find all kinds of interesting little things that aren't necessarily fact-based. And for example, you'll see one website that says, well, the difference is that a pumpkin has a little more of a thorny stalk, a stem on it, and the squash doesn't have quite as thorny a stem, or vice versa, but I don't think that's true. The other thing that you'll see is that, well, a squash has a certain amount of flesh in it, a pumpkin doesn't, but those are kind of all just kind of, not really definitive or fact-based. So the difference between a squash and a pumpkin, sometimes you'll see two. Well, a pumpkin is anything that's decorative, a squash is something you eat. But those are all just kind of not very
And a gourd is something you just look at.
Yeah, a gourd you look at, yeah. And so anyway, so if we kind of take a look at the whole squash and pumpkin thing, squash and pumpkin, by the way, it's interesting. We probably each have our own version in our head. What's a squash? What's a pumpkin? Okay, in my own head, a pumpkin is orange, and we kind of look at it because I've tried eating. We've tried actually making pumpkin pie out of pumpkin, and it's kind of stringy. So in my mind, a pumpkin is something orange that we use mostly for decoration. The squash are something we eat. But, that's also not very definitive. So if we take a look at it, both squash and pumpkin are kind of vine crops. And they're in a botanical family called the Cucurbitaceae family. And they're both of a genus. So we have the family, okay, then below that is kind of the genus. And they're both of the genus Cucurbita. So they're both cucurbits. Sometimes you see that term. And so they're both in that same genus. So they're closely related, squash, pumpkin. And then there are 3 or 4 different species of that Cucurbita genus. And pumpkins and squash are intermingled within those 3 species. So whether you call it a squash, a pumpkin, now many of the botanists say, well, that whole group is actually squash. And so pumpkins are kind of a subset of squash. But when you take a look at the different cultivars of pumpkin and the different cultivars of squash, they're intermingled within these three species. And so if that makes sense.
Yeah.
So they're all closely related in the same genus. They're intermingled in about 3 or 4 different species. So I think it's going to be very difficult to argue, is something a pumpkin, is something a squash. So I think we can kind of and does it really matter?
Right. No.
It doesn't really matter if it's technically a squash or a pumpkin.
It does when the store.
I guess if you're a squash or a pumpkin,
it does when the grocery store has a sale on 99-cent squash, 99 cents a pound squash. That's
and if you try to grab a pumpkin
right.
and argue that I should be getting the sale price,
you may be.
They may argue.
You're probably getting a better deal than if you. Cause I think anyway, so pumpkin.
Yeah.
Price.
So it makes it interesting because if you do look, there are some people that are very passionate about, is this a squash or is this a pumpkin? But the bottom line is they're closely related and they're within different species of that same genus.
Did that cucurbita, does that also include like a cucumber?
Yes.
Okay.
Yep, it does. They're all in that same family, the vine crops.
Okay.
And now I would have to double check the genus of the cucumber.
Okay.
I'm not sure if that's in the same genus or closely related genus, but they're all within that same family. Cucumbers, watermelon, muskmelon, pumpkins, squash, all within that same botanical family, the cucurbits. And I'd have to check on the species of those. I think they probably are all cucurbita, but I'd have to check.
So pumpkin and squash, fruit or vegetable?
Definitely fruit. Pumpkins and squash. Now, and the reason I say fruit, because the definition of a fruit is a ripened ovary. And so a ripened ovary is something that has seeds in it. So if the product has seeds in it, it's it's a fruit.
Okay.
So anything that has seeds in is a fruit, which is a ripened ovary. But there's kind of just a common name usage that can be used too. So oftentimes a fruit or a vegetable depends how you use it, how you eat it. So kind of in our heads, lots of us kind of know. Many of us kind of think, is this a fruit or is this a vegetable? So tomato has seeds in it, so it's a fruit. But most of us probably think of tomato as a vegetable, don't we?
Right. And
so, you could go the botanic version. So anything with seeds, definitely a fruit. Or you can kind of go the common usage as to is it a fruit or a vegetable. So, if you brought a fruit platter somewhere, you probably wouldn't put tomato.
Right.
And
you probably wouldn't put a pumpkin on it.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So it's kind of an interesting terminology.
Well, lots to talk about today with pumpkins, and when we're going to take a quick little break, and when we come back, we're going to talk a little bit about the history of the jack-o'-lantern.
Oh, awesome.
Get 3 months of local news for just 99 cents a month. You'll get unlimited access to the news you need to stay engaged and connected to your community. Visit inforum.com/subscribe now to get 3 months of local news for only 99 cents a month.
All right, we're back and we're talking pumpkins today as kind of as a little fall special, something to do. And one of the things obviously right now with pumpkins and Halloween around the corner, you think of pumpkins and jack-o'-lanterns. And when we were talking about this show, we were wondering kind of about the history of the jack-o'-lantern and how it came to be.
Why did they ever start carving a pumpkin up to be a jack-o'-lantern?
So I think what I did know, early on, or what I'd heard, is that it goes back to some Celtic rituals, right? But there's more to it than that. So I had to go back and I looked at history.com, and National Geographic was actually a really good source for this. And according to National Geographic, the tradition of carving vegetables or fruit goes back thousands of years to Northern European Celtic cultures, though most carved then were turnips, because pumpkins weren't in Europe yet, because if you go back hundreds of years, pumpkins only came to Europe after the Pilgrims came over here.
Sure. Now that's a stretch. I would not think to carve up a turnip.
No, and
put it on my doorstep.
Well, so yeah, exactly. So this happened in Ireland and Scotland. So and actually even so far back that it even may predate Christianity. And some historians believe that the carved, fruit or vegetable heads, would a turnip be a vegetable?
Yes.
Turnip
it's a root crop, so it has no seeds in it, so it's not a fruit. So a vegetable.
As opposed to a pumpkin. So in this case, we'll say carved vegetables, like a turnip. That they say that it was either used as this kind of. Sometimes you would see these head figures, these kind of adoration things, or they say it could have been used as a symbol for a defeated enemy. So basically serving as the symbol for a severed head, which is pretty gruesome.
It is.
But the Celtic festival, we sometimes pronounce it Samhain, but I think it's traditionally called Samhain. It's observed on November 1st, which traditionally marked the end of the harvest. And that set the tone for kind of modern day Halloween, how we celebrate it. On Samhain Eve, October 31st, it was believed that spirits of the dead walked among the living. So to keep the bad spirits away, people would wear costumes and carve faces in root vegetables, like the turnips or beets or even potatoes. So at the time, also, metal lanterns would have been very expensive. They wouldn't have been available to everybody. So some people would carve out these vegetables and put a candle in there or a piece of coal as a way of kind of shooting off light. So
interesting.
Yeah, you've got maybe an opening carved up.
So the tradition of sticking a light or candle inside a jack-o'-lantern.
Yeah, exactly, and that's how it came to be. But there's also in the 1700s in England. If you didn't know a man's name, sometimes you would just refer to them as a jack, right? So you hear that a lot. Old English
jack of all trades.
Jack of all trades. And then also you hear Jack the Ripper, the notorious killer in the late 1800s. So a night watchman may have been called a Jack of the Lantern, somebody who's carrying around a lantern. And so jack-o'-lantern. So that's one idea for where it came up. But of course, and I'm going to say this as somebody of Irish descent, we believe that Irish did so much for civilization.
Of course.
But so there's an old 18th century folk tale which focuses on a character named Stingy Jack. And Stingy Jack had all kinds of stories about him, but one of which was that he was so cheap, hence the name, and he asked the devil out for a drink. And so the devil appears and they're going to go out for the drink, and Stingy Jack is so cheap, he tries to get the devil to pay, and he convinces the devil to turn himself into a coin, and that the coin, they can both buy a drink for this coin. So the devil turns himself into a coin, but Stingy Jack, as he is, as his namesake is, he decides to pocket the coin. He's going to keep the money. So he pockets the coin and he keeps it next to a cross in his pocket. And so the devil is powerless. He has to remain a coin, right? So after a while, Stingy Jack lets him loose on the condition that, okay, for a year, you won't bother me. You won't take my soul, anything like that. So devil agrees. Devil returns to form. So close to a year later or sometime later, Stingy Jack runs into the devil again, and he convinces the devil, hey, go up into this tree and grab some fruit. So the devil goes up into the tree to grab the fruit, and Stingy Jack, in the meantime, carves something in to the tree trunk that kind of keeps the devil prisoner in the tree. And he convinces the devil, I will let you down if for 10 years you don't bother me or take my soul. The devil agrees. They go their own ways. So in that time in between, after a couple of years, after some period, Stingy Jack dies. So Stingy Jack dies. Well, God realizes that Stingy Jack is not worthy of heaven, so he doesn't want him in heaven. The devil has been screwed over by Stingy Jack, so he doesn't want him in hell. But he kind of takes some pity on him because he still owes him a little bit. So he agrees not to take his soul, but he says, you're going to have to wander the earth. And so to wander the earth, he gives Stingy Jack a lone piece of coal, and Stingy Jack hollows out a turnip and walks the countryside, the dark night, in eternity, kind of looking for a place to call home. So that's kind of where also another origin where this kind of where it becomes a little bit more creepy, right? A little bit more on the dark side.
That's a fascinating story.
Yeah. So this was
some of the folklore of this is fascinating.
It's great, isn't it? It's so fun.
It is.
And so when the Irish came over to America, they would still start by carving turnips and things like that. But turnips are rock hard. As our sugar beets. Anybody who's out there now and unfortunately runs into one with their car, that they are rock hard. So the Irish come over, the Irish, the Scottish, the English come over, and they realize they know these stories, they know this tradition, but then they discover the pumpkin, which is much easier to carve, much easier
to hollow out for the light.
Yeah, and bigger, so you can cast more light. So this kind of all works together with, as America is kind of coming along and growing up. So this is interesting because then we also get into the legend of Sleepy Hollow.
Yes, I was thinking of that.
Yeah, and so the Legend of Sleepy Hollow by Washington Irving, which was written in about 1820. In the initial, I think in the initial story, there really wasn't. He wasn't riding around with a jack-o'-lantern on his head, but the headless horseman. But as the headless horseman encounters Ichabod Crane, and Ichabod Crane flees for his life, and he crosses this bridge, which again will bring him to freedom. That the headless horseman can't cross the bridge. He turns back and he looks, and the headless horseman, in the original, throws his severed head at him. But later it became a jack-o'-lantern.
Yeah, because in the cartoon version, I think that we played with for our kids on our VHS.
Yeah.
I think he throws a jack-o'-lantern, doesn't he? A flaming jack-o'-lantern,
and
maybe?
So in kind of recent tellings, he has more of a jack-o'-lantern head. But in the original, too, that where the horse ends up the next day outside of his master's house, just grazing, and people look for Ichabod Crane. They can't find him. They go back to the bridge and they see that there's been a rider through there, and they see the horse's saddle is there, and they see the remains of a smashed pumpkin. So that's kind of maybe where the where the whole jack-o'-lantern head comes in.
Sure.
So that kind of brings us again more into a Halloween thing. But even interesting, even before that, the Cinderella story. There's a pumpkin in the Cinderella. Yeah. And, of course, we have to go back to Cinderella goes back to even BC times. Cinderella's it's a variation of a classic Greek story. So ancient Greek story. So this goes way back. But
sure, because her carriage is going to turn into a pumpkin, right? If she doesn't,
should they turn the carriage? So if
she doesn't make it home by the stroke of midnight, am I remembering it?
Yep. And through the years, the story gets retold and it gets kind of built on. And so in about like the late 1800s, maybe there's a version, the French version, and that introduces the pumpkin, and the pumpkin is turned into a carriage, and she's able to ride back. But exactly, if she doesn't get back by the stroke of midnight, kind of all the spells break, and she like her gown goes back to being her regular tattered dress, and the pumpkin or the carriage turns into a pumpkin. So that's again where we get the notion that you'll turn into a pumpkin, you'll kind of revert to your original.
Well, right. I oftentimes joke to Mary that if I don't make it to bed by midnight, I'm going to turn into a pumpkin.
Yes, exactly. So things like that. So the pumpkin is around in pop culture, and it's been around before the 20th century.
It's fascinating how they use some of those other traditions and then found the pumpkin. They had the pumpkin.
Yes.
So then they transferred some of those traditions onto the pumpkin.
That's how utilitarian the pumpkin is.
It's much more classy than a turnip.
Yes, exactly. The lowly turnip. And what was interesting is that you were talking about the version of Cinderella that I think a lot of Americans know is the Disney version, the animated, I think 1950 Disney version, Bippity Boppity Boo,
right?
And and the stepmother, or not the stepmother, but the fairy godmother rather, turns the pumpkin into a carriage. So when the animators were trying to do this, they had a variety of pumpkin called the Rouge Vif de Temp pumpkin. And
wow,
so,
nice pronunciation.
I try. I'm not sure if I did it so well. French Francophiles can correct me on that. Right. So the Disney animators had this in their kind of their drawing studio. They were using this as the
kind of the model,
as the inspiration.
Which to draw. Oh, sure.
So once the movie came out and the movie became a hit, that variety of pumpkin, I'll say it again for everybody's amusement, the Rouge Vif d'Étampes pumpkin, that became known as the Cinderella pumpkin.
Sure, because it had that certain shape.
Yeah.
Yeah,
and so I'm
picturing in my head that carriage and the pumpkin. Yeah,
yeah. So it kind of all comes full circle. That now what we know is the Cinderella pumpkin. Had a totally different name, but it was that's where it came from. Yeah. So all these things kind of work together and pumpkin folklore and in American culture.
No wonder we love the pumpkin.
Yeah. Well, we'll take a quick break, and when we come back, we'll talk more about pumpkin love, but also how to grow pumpkins.
Great.
How we're going to grow pumpkins, and how they're prepared, how they're used for food.
If you're loving this podcast, be sure to check out our full lineup. From news and local politics to sports and true crime, find your next great listen right now at inforum.com/podcasts. That's inforum.com/podcasts.
Okay, we're back and we're talking pumpkins, and we're going to talk about how to grow pumpkins. But first of all, let's talk a little bit about the history of growing pumpkins in North America, because it's got a really kind of a colorful history and tradition, doesn't it, Don?
Oh, it sure does, because they were the pumpkins native to North America. Our Native Americans made good use of them. And one of the classics that you hear about in gardening is the Three Sisters method. And pumpkin squash are one of those three sisters, whether it's pumpkins, whether it's squash. Okay, that's one of the three sisters. The other two sisters are corn, also known as maize, and the other is beans. And of course, beans could be different types of string beans, any edible type beans. Well, those three combinations were a very smart combination because, you've got the upright corn, and you've got either squash or pumpkins that would run around in between, so they'd make use of the space vine in between. But they would also help in some ways to kind of give some support to the corn, but also they'd cover the ground so that the weeds would stay out of the corn. And then the beans, legumes, fix nitrogen into the soil. Just because that's what they do. That's what they can do. So the legumes, would get fertility into the ground for both the corn and the pumpkins to use. So the three crops together work so nicely. Each gives something to the others. And the beans also provided some support to the corn so it wouldn't topple over.
Because they climb up the corn, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And then, some of the pole-type beans would climb up the sweet corn and not overpower it. But yeah, so the three of them work so well together. So what an ingenious method, the Three Sisters. And so the squash, pumpkins, again, they're kind of a combination of species there. So, but their main thing was they were eating them. They weren't using the pumpkins for decoration, but they were using the squash type pumpkins for eating. So yeah, kind of a neat way. And even today, some people will do that same thing. I let our squash and pumpkins go into the corn because, especially if you're limited in space, why not let some of those things intermingle? And they bear really nicely. It's kind of fun. You find a nice pumpkin growing right down the rows of corn, and so that's fun. And so, yeah, pumpkins, big business, like we said, big business to grow. So each year in the U.S., it's over 1.5 billion pounds of pumpkins. And the other thing that's interesting is, since it's a fall-type harvest, most of those billions of pumpkins are in October when it's harvested. Maybe the end of September, first part of October. And so, yeah, it's kind of a short harvest window.
I saw that Illinois is by far the number one state producing pumpkins. And I didn't see the number of how much they do, but I think it's like overwhelmingly they are the largest pumpkin
producing state.
Well, and Minnesota has a claim now for producing the largest pumpkin ever in the world. Earlier this month, a horticulture teacher from Anoka, Minnesota, the Halloween capital of the world.
What was the size of that pumpkin?
He set a world record for the heaviest pumpkin with 2,749 pounds.
Wow.
Which was over 100 pounds bigger than the previous pumpkin, I believe.
Wow, awesome. I wonder what the size dimensions, you maybe don't have that, but that's got to be one of those huge. And of course, one of the species, we mentioned that these pumpkins are in about 3 or 4 species, and that Big Macs type pumpkin, those big ones that you need to move with a forklift.
Yes.
They're in one of those species, Cucurbita maximum.
Yeah.
And I suppose maximum meaning big size. And so it's fascinating.
Yeah, it is really interesting. So
Anoka, the Halloween capital of the world.
They got that name. Well, I think they gave themselves that name.
Sure.
But in 1920, they decided that they were having enough of kids mischief.
Tipping over outhouses.
Yep, and letting livestock loose on the city streets, things like that. So they decided to have an organized Halloween event. So they had a Halloween parade, and then they had kind of organized trick-or-treating. So Anoka claims to be the first city to kind of organize Halloween events as a way to kind of curb youthful shenanigans. So they get to claim that they are the Halloween capital of the world.
And I bet they have mountains of pumpkins
yes, they do.
in town to prove it. So it's interesting. So if we were going to grow pumpkins in our own yard or our own gardens, and I enjoy pumpkins, that is one of the most fascinating crops. I was going to say vegetable, but vegetable. It's one of the most fascinating crops for kids to grow. We've always planted those with our kids because they plant the seeds. The seeds are big, easy to plant for kids. The planting depth isn't so critical, about an inch deep or so. And they can just see the results. They can watch these pumpkins grow and develop all summer long, watch them turn orange in the fall. And so a great kid crop.
When you get to see the flowers before they even start to fruit, and that's really fun to see.
Yeah, it is. And, in botany, botanically, on a pumpkin, same thing with squash, the male and female blossoms are separate. And so it's kind of fun. You can see the female blossom, which has the little miniature pumpkin at the base of the yellow petals. So it's kind of fun to even see that. And, of course, they're pollinated by the bees. So when choosing a pumpkin to plant, the variety, and there's something like 250 different varieties and cultivars. And so some of the seed catalogs have pages of the different cultivars of pumpkins to choose from. So when I'm looking at them, what I do is, in my own head, I have kind of a classic pumpkin shape that I like. Other people probably think of something else. I like kind of this, kind of a rounded, maybe like the Cinderella carriage type. I like that type. Mm-hmm. Others prefer maybe a more of a vertical pumpkin. And so you kind of have an idea when you're selecting a variety, kind of have in mind that shape that you'd like, and also the size, too, whether it's one that has kind of a uniformly large size. Also, for anybody that is wanting to grow one for pie, if you want the true pumpkin pie, there are sugar pie varieties that have a little thicker flesh and not quite as stringy, and also a little sweeter. So there are definitely some that we think of as typical pie pumpkins. But also, you and I have discussed, too, that the canned pumpkin that we buy is actually a squash.
Yeah, it is that, and I think a lot of people prefer to use squash, that it's less stringy than using pumpkin.
Exactly, and so many gardeners say, well, for my pumpkin pie, I'm actually using buttercup squash.
Yes.
And so many of the squash type, So it's fascinating. So other things in growing, pumpkins, of course, they require quite a bit of space, so they're allowed to vine. But there are some bush types. So for people for raised gardens or small space gardens, there are bush type pumpkins that you can grow. Or also you can put them vines on a trellis and grow them vertically. You'll get some pretty good pumpkins on that. And also, you don't always have to let the vines just run and run. At a certain point in the growing season, you can nip off the ends and let bear what is already forming on those. So you don't have to let them just have their run of the garden all season long. One of the, they're quite carefree to grow. But one of the main things to watch for on pumpkins is powdery mildew, and that's the grayish coating that develops. And once that develops on the leaves, common also on squash and cucumbers, melons, once that grayish coating develops, it won't wash off, won't revert back to normal, and it can cause a drying and early dying of the foliage. And so your pumpkins will be less healthy. So keep an eye out for that. If you start seeing a little bit of a whitish coat or little white dots, grayish white, maybe a little fuzzy dots, get a fungicide on there right away, an all-purpose vegetable garden fungicide, because that needs to be prevented. Once they're gray with that powdery mildew, it won't revert back to normal. So be on the lookout for that. And
so is that something that's similar to peonies, that's why it's so important to peonies to water at the base of the plant, not water from above?
That's another good point for preventing it on pumpkins. Water just the soil and not the leaves of the pumpkins. So yeah, powdery mildew is a similar fungi that attacks the peony. And lilacs, if you ever looked at lilacs, they'll sometimes have this grayish white coating. There are different kind of forms of powdery mildew, but all similar.
Okay.
Yeah. So otherwise, they're a warm season crop, like the other vine crops, cucumbers, melons. They're warm season crops, so we don't want to plant them too early. But sometime May 25th to the 30th, you can either direct seed pumpkins direct out in the garden. They'll ripen in plenty of time. Or you can start plants or buy plants from garden centers too. Since they're so easy to grow, I usually just direct seed them into the garden when the soil is warm.
All right.
Add a little fertilizer during the season to get some extra big pumpkins.
That's what that Anoka professor, he's a landscape. He teaches landscaping and horticulture at I think the community college there, and he said he was just very active in he grows a lot of pumpkins, but he's very active in watering and fertilizing.
Sure. Oh, yeah. Interesting. And the other thing, too, well, obviously, he was out to win the record.
Yes.
So, obviously, too, he would have started with one of these pumpkin cultivars that is capable of reaching that size. We can't take a sugar pie pumpkin and
sugar pie pumpkins, for reference, they're really petite. They're very, very small.
They're a small pumpkin
probably
with good,
about
thick
two
flesh.
hands. You can entirely
more like what we would think of a squash.
Yeah,
except they're orange.
Yep.
Yeah, and so that's interesting. That gentleman, the idea that you need to lift a pumpkin with a forklift is kind of neat. I don't think the eating quality is probably very, very good on those. But that could feed maybe the whole town of Anoka.
Probably not for us, but like one of the great things about usually in the week after Halloween, you'll see, around here there'll be Take Back Jack, where you can drop off your used jack-o'-lantern as long as it's not been painted or anything like that, and they'll be turned into compost so that they can be used. But then also it's always fun. Bigger zoos will take jack-o'-lanterns and pumpkins, and then they'll feed them they'll bring them to different animals, especially like the tigers. They like playing with them and then like noshing them, and they'll give them to hippos. You get to see hippos just crush them because there's nutritional value there.
Sure. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, let's talk a little bit about that. That the nutritional value. What are the health benefits that we get from pumpkins?
Well, pumpkins, of course, being one of the yellow vegetables. See, it's interesting. Even though pumpkin is botanically a fruit, we don't. I don't call it a fruit,
right?
But one of the yellow vegetables,
right?
It's got the good stuff that we get from eating carrots and all the other yellow things. Beta carotene, and lots of vitamin A and those types of things. So very nutritious. The other thing that's fascinating is that all parts of the pumpkin plant and the fruit itself can be eaten. I did not know that. I didn't know that some cultures eat the leaves.
Yeah.
Like the country that I mentioned, Zambia, where the pumpkin was taken to Africa. And then some of the cultures make use of the entire plant, including boiling the leaves.
Again, we talk about pumpkin pie as a Thanksgiving tradition, and I'm not sure when it started, but in the early colonies, the American colonies, their version of a pumpkin pie would be to bake it inside the pie shell, not a pie shell, but the actual pumpkin itself.
Oh.
You use the rind as kind of the baking thing, and it'd be more like a porridge, really. Less like the kind of the custard that we know now. But yeah, pumpkins used to be baked, just kind of like you would bake a squash. You just put the whole thing, cut it in half, put the whole thing in there. Well, this they would probably hollow out the pumpkin, mix in some kind of milks and spices, and then they would probably bake that over embers of a...
So if we see the caricature of the pilgrim lady carrying this pie as we know it, might not be totally
not
accurate.
Quite true, right? Another of some false history from revision there.
Do you like pumpkin seeds?
Yeah, I do a little
seeds?
bit. Yeah.
We've roasted them before.
Yeah.
There are different recipes for roasting them. Kind of with some barbecue type seasoning on. And of course, I suppose if you salt them too heavily, it probably detracts from the nutritional value. But there's a lot of good nutrition in pumpkin seeds too. And they do make a good snack.
Yeah. How do you know when it's time to pick a pumpkin? Or a squash?
Good point. Yeah. Because, and the factors of determining a ripe pumpkin and squash are the same, since they're so closely related. And, okay, so a couple of things. Of course, on a pumpkin, the typical pumpkin, the color will be good and orange. And also, on both pumpkin and squash, the rind loses its glossiness. It becomes a little more dull. For example, we think of buttercup squash, too. They're quite glossy, but when they're ripe, they have kind of a dullness to them. But one of the best ways is the thumbnail test on both a pumpkin and a squash. When they're nice and ripe, mature, the rind will be so hard that you can't dent it with your thumbnail. Then they're good and hard. I had an interesting question that was emailed to me, wondering if squash, pumpkins would be the same thing. Is it possible for them to get overripe on the vine? Someone was fairly new to gardening, wondered if, am I supposed to pick these? Are they going to get overripe?
Is there a window?
Right, yeah. But no. Pumpkin squash can be left on until after we have some freezes. The old saying, the frost is on the pumpkin.
Okay.
That's fine. I like to leave both out until after we have some frost, because then the vines collapse and I can find them better. And it doesn't hurt the pumpkins or squash. So after the frost has killed the vines, then it's fine to cut them off, and they both should be cut from the vine. The stems can be kind of sensitive, and both pumpkin and squash will keep better if that stem is left intact. If that breaks off, then that spot underneath, if you've ever noticed, is a little bit soft,
Yep.
and it's more likely to start some rotting.
Okay.
So that's also interesting. When they're breeding pumpkin types, especially jack-o'-lantern style pumpkins, they breed specifically for stems that will be strong and attached. Yeah, because if we grab our jack-o'-lantern if we grab that pumpkin by its stem, which is sometimes the easiest way to grab it, if that pops off right away, then that pumpkin might not keep as long, because that kind of enters that soft spot where it could rot. So they actually do breed for a very strong stem that will remain attached onto a pumpkin.
Interesting.
Yeah, so it's interesting. They don't only breed for size and shape, but also for a strong stem.
Lots of interesting stuff today talking about pumpkins.
Yeah, fun topic.
I know I learned a lot. Hopefully the listeners did too.
I've always loved pumpkins. I've found them fascinating since I was a kid. Just there's something about them. I can see why.
Yeah.
They're a good kid type.
Well, like you were saying, from the planting on, it's very hands-on, but yet hands-off. It's easy for a kid to do. They can plant their own pumpkin, but you really do see the growth of you see it, really readily. It is incremental, but you can go back from week to week and things will change drastically, both in like how much the vine has grown, and then once the pumpkin starts forming, you can really take note.
You sure can. You see, I guess I've never grown up because I find pumpkin growing just as fascinating now as I ever did. And so it's fun. I think we each have our idea of what that classic pumpkin is. And so I just have fun experimenting with different pumpkin cultivars and kind of see what shapes I can get. And I have a good time with it.
Well, that's going to do it for another episode of Growing Together, the gardening podcast. Don, if people have questions for you, whether it's about their pumpkin or whether they just want to ask you any kind of gardening question or just send you a picture from their good garden, what's the best way to reach you?
We're always fun to chat gardening by email. And email address is donald.kinsler, that's Kinsler with a Z, Kinzler, at ndsu.edu.
All right. Well, we will talk to you next week.
See you next week, and thanks everyone for listening.